Okay, so good morning, everyone. Welcome to the audio session. I'm Myung-Ori from Busan National University, and as you already know, each presentation has 12 minutes for presentation, followed by 3 minutes of Q&A. So I will ring a bell at 12, so you can wrap up your presentation if you hear the ring. So let's start with our first presentation. Birds of a feather augmented together, exploring sonic links between real and virtual worlds in audio augmented reality by Jake Bhattacharya.
Okay, thanks everyone for coming down. As introduced, my name is Jake Bhattacharya. I'm from the University of Glasgow, and I'm here to present my paper, Exploring Sonic Links Between Real and Virtual Worlds in Audio Augmented Reality, which is a bit of a wordy title. So I want to first talk about before I get into the rest of the paper, I want to first talk about the last three words in that title, Audio Augmented Reality. For those of you that don't know, in the broadest possible sense of the word, audio augmented reality, or AAR, is AR that is audio only. It hasn't got any visuals involved whatsoever, which is more accessible than ever, possibly the most accessible form of AR, because really all you need to experience audio AR is a smartphone and a pair of earphones, which at this stage pretty much everyone owns anyways. However, that accessibility has not translated into any sort of widespread adoption of audio AR applications. They remain very niche. There's not that many people researching them or making them. And part of the reason for that, I would contend, is the fact that there's no real clear understanding of what audio AR is yet. We don't really know yet when listening to sound becomes audio AR. Now, some people have tried to rigorously define it. There's a lot of definitions of AAR floating around there. The most recent one comes from Abranil Dam and colleagues, who tried to use grounded theory to arrive at a definition for audio AR, and they eventually came up with three pillars that underpin audio AR. One, that the system is connected to a user's environment. Two, that it's adapted to the user's context. And three, that it is goal-directed. But they didn't really provide any clear guidance for when a system actually achieves those three pillars. What does the system have to do to meet those requirements? Now, in broader AR, Hannah Schraffenberger introduced this concept of real virtual connections being crucial to AR, this idea that virtual elements have to be in some way connected to the real world to establish an AR experience. And I like this notion quite a lot, as does my colleague back at Glasgow, Mark McGill, who brought this notion into his definition of audio AR, claiming that AAR exploits spatial congruence with real-world elements. But I don't think there's any particular reason that we need to limit ourselves just to spatial connections between real and virtual for AAR, or indeed any other form of AR. So I've thought about this I'm a PhD student, I'm a third-year PhD student, so I've thought about 3 years what AAR is, and I've arrived at this definition here. Audio AR is the creation of a virtual world represented through sound, which is linked to the real world and allows users to achieve goals in one world by interacting with the other, which is a definition that builds on these prior discussions. There's a much greater, longer discussion in the paper that I don't have time to go through, but you can go and check that out if you're interested in. But our definition is one of the first that provides actually clear criteria for when a system is audio AR. One, that audio is the primary modality, that there are real and virtual elements, that those real and virtual elements are clearly linked to one another, and that those real and virtual elements are both necessary to achieve a user's goals. And this last point I think is quite interesting because we're in reality right now. No one's gonna disagree with me on that one. One of the reasons I know that I'm in reality right now is because I'm taking an action. I'm standing up here and presenting my paper to you to hopefully achieve my goal of getting some of you to read my paper and maybe even cite my paper. Therefore, we're in reality. If I was in a virtual world presenting my virtual paper to a virtual audience in the hopes of getting virtual reads and virtual citations, that would be virtual reality. So it follows, as far as I'm concerned then, that in augmented reality, the actions that we are taking and the goals we are trying to achieve would have to be in different worlds, or else we are just experiencing reality or virtual reality. And our definition is kind of deliberately broad on what links between real and virtual worlds are possible. Because in audio AR, as far as I'm concerned, I see auditory links as being particularly crucial going forward. And these, we have a sound-based form of AR. Should we not have a sound-based connection between the real and virtual elements? I certainly think so. There's many forms this could take. The two that I identify, but there are probably more, are acoustic links, where the acoustics of one world would influence the other. For example, you've got your virtual sound. It's in this room with us, so we simulate the acoustics of the real space so that the reverberation and echoes and the behavior of sound in this room is applied to the virtual sound so that that also sounds as it would if it was here. I've done some work on this in the past. Lots of other people do work on this. But the more important one that I see is sonic links, which is the other part of our title, where the sounds present in one world influence the other. And this is interesting, I think, because if you think again about visual AR always tries to understand our virtual surroundings, or visual surroundings rather. It tries to identify objects in the environment, map the three-dimensional spaces, things like this, so that it can better augment our real world. Whereas in contrast, audio AR, at least up until now, usually has no understanding of our aural surroundings. They don't pay any attention to what sounds are nearby the user that might influence the way we should present virtual elements to them or connect virtual elements to them. And this, to me, is a really fundamental gap because I don't think we can augment reality without being aware of reality. So, bringing on to the actual work I did, we conducted a user study exploring sonic linking in audio AR, where real sounds influence the AAR experience. So we compared 6 variations on 2 different AAR applications in a loosely controlled outdoor space and used machine learning to detect real-world sounds that drive them. And this was all to try and answer 2 research questions. 1, how does sonic linking affect the user experience of an AAR application? And 2, is a sound classification model capable of creating a sonic link right now? So, as I say, we built 2 AAR applications, and these responded to real-world bird song and vehicle sounds to explore sonic linking. And we built 3 variations on each app. 2 of them were different design variations on sonically linked applications, and 1 was an unlinked control so that we could compare sonic linking to no sonic linking and see how that went. And we used Google's YamNet model for classifying sounds to detect these real-world sounds and then drive the applications. So we had 2 applications. 1 was in a game. It was effectively audio AR Pokemon Go. So when a bird sang in the real world, the system picked that up, and then it spawned a virtual sonic Pokemon for the user to catch. In fact, we called them Sonomon. So there are 3 variations on this. Variation 1 was a sort of a congruent sonic link. So a bird sang in the real world, and you got a bird Sonomon. Clear connection between the 2. We tested an incongruent link, where a bird sang in the real world. You got a dog Pokemon, completely unrelated to the bird, other than the fact that the bird triggered it. And then we had an unlinked version, which is effectively how Pokemon Go works right now, for the 5 people still playing Pokemon Go, where just at random intervals we spawned a cat Sonomon. And these Sonomon were we used spatial audio, so they had a 3D position in the world, they were audio only, and basically the user's task was to kind of turn on the spot until they felt they were facing the sound, and then press a button, and if they had localized the Sonomon correctly, they caught it. Hurrah. And our other application was a music system that adjusted the music volume and frequency content in real time to allow for audibility of certain real-world sounds. So our first variation was one that responded to birdsong again, as a sort of a well-being scenario. Your bird sang in the real world, your music quietened down, the high frequencies got pulled out a little bit, so you could hear the birds alongside your music. And then we had a safety scenario where we did the same for cars. And then we had an unlinked, just a normal, straight music experience like you get on Spotify right now. The music didn't change, the music didn't, you just listen to the song. And we used Billie Jean by Michael Jackson as our demo track. I never want to listen to Billie Jean ever again. But I have to, because I've got some videos to show you quickly about what that looked like. So this is a game scenario. So there's a real bird. There's a bird Sonomon. And you're trying to figure out where it is. I think it's kind of over there. Hurrah, they've caught the Sonomon. That's basically what that app looked like. That was the loop. And then the music app. You're listening to Michael Jackson. Here he goes. And then this car pulls out. The system picks up it on it. It starts to lower the volume and pulls the low frequencies out. So the keyboards kind of disappear. Call this car back to the scene. And it's kind of going over there. You can still hear it. So the system is still responding. And around about there. We can't hear it anymore. And the music comes back. She was more like. So we conducted our study in an outdoor environment, as you saw there. There was a car park, as shown on screen here, so it was kind of a park environment near to a car park. And we had plenty of cars from the car park, but we needed to ensure there was birds, so we hid Bluetooth speakers in the bushes playing bird song, so that there were birds active in the scene. There were real birds as well, but we needed to hide the speakers. We didn't tell anyone that there were hidden birds. No one seemed to pick up on it. I think the birds might have been confused. And basically, participants used each app variation for about 5 minutes, walking back and forth along that pink path, And then they filled out a questionnaire which contained questions from the augmented reality immersion questionnaire, the UEQ, and the questions that we designed on augmentation, responsiveness to real sounds, and response accuracy. So there is my colleague, Graham Wilson, handsomely demonstrating the participant setup. He unfortunately can't be here. So you can see there that he's got these kind of transparent earphones on. They kind of clip on the edge of his ear, but they don't obstruct the ear canal, so he can still hear the real world alongside his virtual audio that we're presenting to him. And he's got a discount Ash Ketchum Pokemon Trainer hat, which is fitted with a head tracker to keep track of his head position for the game, and also a microphone for detecting the sounds. And the study took about an hour, followed by an exit interview. So yeah, I don't have loads of time, so you can see the paper for full results. But effectively what we found, we had 20 participants. What we found is that our sonically linked variations had significantly higher real sound response and response accuracy ratings than our unlinked controls. So the system worked the way it was supposed to. It did respond to the real world sounds. We didn't find any difference on UEQ or ARI ratings. But what we did find is that our sonically linked variations had higher augmentation ratings than our control. And interestingly, in the game scenario, this is only true of the congruent sonic link. The incongruent sonic link was no different from the unlinked variation, which is interesting because the unlinked game scenario, where you get the cats on them spatialized at random points, is effectively the current state of audio AR. You get spatial audio, it's not connected to the environment in any way. Whereas our unlinked music application, where both sonically linked variations were more augmented, is kind of representative of your standard music listening Spotify non-AAR experience. So effectively, what we found is that any link transforms non-AAR applications into AAR, and a congruent sonic link elevates existing approaches to AAR. We did an interview. Again, you can see more results on this in the paper. We found that the majority of people felt positively about sonic linking. There was a preference for the congruent game, the birdsong version. People liked the clear connection between the real thing and the virtual effect. And we had a preference again for the sonically linked music variations. Some people even mentioned the safety system that responded to cars. There's instances where that responded to a vehicle they hadn't heard, which is exactly what we were hoping it would do. So they were able to kind of maintain awareness of a car they otherwise wouldn't hear as a pedestrian. And some participants also felt that it changed their experience. They felt more aware of their surroundings or listened for the sound triggers themselves. So that's a whistle-stop tour of what we did. You can read the paper if you're interested. I would encourage you to. But in conclusion, we present a new definition for audio AR and the first evaluation of sonic linking for audio AR. Our main finding is that sonic linking results in a more augmented AAR experience, one that transforms non-AAR experiences into AAR, and one where congruent sonic links elevate existing AAR scenarios. And congruent links overall seem to offer the best experience. And I'm running out of time, but sonic linking also appears to alter a user's relationship with the real world. So, thanks for your attention. You can reach me via email there. You can reach me via Meet Flaps here at the conference. I'm on LinkedIn there. That might take you to the paper. I don't know. I tried. I don't know if it'll work. But yeah, thanks for your attention. I'm happy to take any questions.
Questions? If you have a question, you raise your hands, please. Any questions from audience? Okay.
Hi, Yifei Cheng, Carnegie Mellon University. Really, really lovely talk. I'm curious about the last point you made on the previous slide. I'm wondering if you could speculate a bit about potential applications that could take advantage of this property of AR.
This last one?
Yes, like your ability to modify the user's relationship with the real world.
Yeah, so I mean, we're still doing work on this area. So I'm still kind of exploring this one because we've done a couple of studies doing this, and they've all returned different things about how users' relationship with the environment is changed by this. And so to be honest, I'm still figuring out what the applications are. It's just an interesting point that it seems as if responding to real world sounds and doing stuff kind of makes people more aware of their surroundings, but doesn't seem to impact their enjoyment of the application. So we were able to kind of give them their music experience, and it was no worse than normal music experiences, but also they were more aware of their surroundings. That seemed to be a positive thing for some people. But I don't really know where that goes. Obviously it's a great avenue for future work. If you have a cool idea for where that goes, I'd love to hear hear what it is, and wish you all the best in doing it. That's a crap answer for your question, I'm afraid, but it's the one I've got. Yeah.
Thank you so much.
And we can have one more question, I guess.
I was wondering if there's any problem of playing sound over real sound cause some interfering. Okay, if you want to listen real voice sound, but because of the augmented on top, you can't hear the original voice sounds anymore. Was there any comments like that from the participants, or it's okay in general?
So we didn't have any comments, like no one seemed to, if anything, we had the opposite. There were some participants who were like, I don't want to hear these birds when I'm listening to my music. I don't want to hear cars when I'm listening to my music. I like to just listen to my music. No one complained about the opposite way, where they got like, you know, the perception, I guess the game scenario would be the one where that would happen. And the game scenario, people seem to actually kind of like, it seemed like they got, you know, they listened to the bird sound and then they got this bird Pokemon. They sort of overlaid, they kind of conflated the two as one thing. So some people wanted, the main feedback we got was that, you know, the bird Sonomon would appear just in a random position, whereas they wanted it to kind of transform the real bird into the bird Sonomon, which is quite a tricky technical problem. So it's something for people in the future to do. Definitely a cool idea, but we didn't have anyone who objected to that, like you were saying. Although it's probably, I imagine that different we obviously only tested 2 applications that are sonically linked, and future ones could take any number of forms where that might be a problem. So it's definitely a potential problem and one that we should look at. But yeah, we didn't find any insights on that in this study.
All right, so let's thank the presenter. And
hello, welcome everyone to my presentation. As you already introduced me, I'm Laura Schütz. I'm a PhD candidate at Technical University of Munich, and together with my colleagues Sassan, Martin Fahr, Ulrich Eck, Daniel Roth, and my supervisor Nasir Nawab, we worked on this project called Sonify Anything towards context-aware sonic interactions in AR. And I thank Jake for this immensely great intro on why we would need more contextual and linked interactions on a sound level. So before we start, I have a kind of a question for you, and that is, what is the sound that happens when a real object and a virtual object collides? Nothing? So because of the lack of materiality of virtual objects, of course, in the beginning, there would be no sound. But what you can, of course, do these days, and what some headsets do, is that you use meshing or plane detection, and then you play an ever same generic sound, no matter what the material or the object is that your virtual object might be interacting with. But that creates incongruent experiences where what we see and what we hear is not the same, where we might hear boing even though I'm hitting a metal plate. And so in an attempt to create audiovisual congruence during interactions between real and virtual objects, we propose this framework for context-aware material-based sounds. And so how it works is that we take the camera images from the egocentric view of the headset camera, and then we use a pre-trained material segmentation model that recognizes the materials of the real objects in the environment. And then we take this collision point, and at the point of collision, we perform some temporal and some spatial smoothing of these pixel-wise material labels to then get a robust material recognition of the object that we were interacting with. And then we can look up these RGBD values in a table of materials that are within the classification system. And then we can see what kind of physical properties these materials have. So if red, for example, corresponds to wood, we would look up the physical properties of density or stiffness or elasticity. And then we can use that to parameterize a physical sound model. So there's something called physical modeling synthesis, which is one approach from the 80s or 90s in audio synthesis that you can use to model these physical interactions. And so then we apply this excitation that is happening between the real and virtual object to that sound model. And then we can compute how these vibrations basically go through this object and then at listening points pick up a material-based sounds. That is now hopefully congruent with the thing that you would see and hope to hear. And of course, we wanted to test if this actually works and if this can actually make the interaction realism in AR higher. And so in the user study, we evaluated a few things: material identification accuracy, identification confidence, sonic interaction realism, and how well people could now distinguish between visually similar materials that might just be physically distinct. And we included a variety of materials for that, just to make sure that this framework that we proposed would apply to a wide range of it. So everything from very soft materials like fabric or rubber to very hard and very stiff materials like, for example, ceramic or metal. And so there were 2 tasks in that study. And so the first task asked the user to use a virtual stick, so the blue stick that you see, and use that virtual stick to tap on different material samples from that library that we had created. And so they always had just one sample in front of them, and then using the stick, they had to determine based on what they were seeing and what they were hearing, what material they were having in front of them. And so they had these 2 conditions, right? The generic one, where no matter if it was glass or rubber or cork, it would always be the same generic sound, or the material-based, using the framework that I presented earlier. And so let's listen to a video of what that sounded like. And so then we saw that with these, the material identification accuracy was the same almost for the generic and material base, because it was very obvious to them visually already what kind of material they were facing, but that the realism ratings that they were giving were now much higher for the interaction. But when we look at these realism ratings broken down into the different materials, we can see that there's a trend of softer materials like cardboard, cork, or fabric to be rated less realistic than harder materials, like, for example, ceramic or stone. And that is because soft materials, they have very high damping coefficients, and they have very low stiffness. And that means that the sound that is created is a very low frequency sound, and it doesn't have a long temporal evolution, which means it's barely audible. And so the realism, therefore, was lower. And I think future work could look into how more softer materials could be sonified more realistically. So then we had a second task, where now participants were given 2 samples that imitated to be the same. For example, they both look like wood, but physically they were distinct. So one might have been plastic, and the other one might have been actually the wood. And then we again asked them to use the generic sound and material-based sounds to distinguish between the 2 of them. And so let's also listen to a video of that. And so now we could see that, of course, the material identification accuracy was much higher when they had these congruent sounds. And we also saw that now their confidence in correctly identifying what they were interacting with was also much higher, which kind of means they were better linked or better understanding of the materials that they were interacting with through the help of the virtual objects. And so all of this that I've shown you was in a controlled experiment environment. But of course, you can also use this then for any unseen environment to create these real-time context-aware interactions. And so here's a video again to show you what that would sound like. So what you heard is that, of course, there's still room for improvement, right? So, for example, the iPad sounded like it was maybe like a metal plate that's suspended in the air, has a lot of room for vibration and resonance, versus it's actually a solid object, right? And on top of that, it is lying on a tabletop surface. So future work could, for example, to improve the realism on top of what we've presented to make it even more realistic, include the real object geometry. For now, we assumed everything was a plate. But of course, a small bell, for example, if I hit it, will be higher frequency, right, than I have hit a really big bell. So object geometry, of course, would matter Then the inclusion of, for example, the relations between objects. Like I said, if something is up in the air, it has a very different resonance than if I put it on a table. And then also modeling of these bidirectional sonic interactions. So what we did is only simulate the real object. So that was the only sound model we had created. But there's also, of course, a bidirectional force and vibrations happening. So also maybe modeling the virtual objects sound might be interesting. And then lastly, we only looked at tapping interactions, so impacts. But of course, when we interact with our environment, we do much more complex and diverse interactions. So rolling, scraping, things like that could also be interesting to look at. Yeah, so if you have any ideas, feedback or questions, I'm happy if you come see me after and talk to me. And that was our paper, Sonify Anything, and I'm happy to take your questions.
Thank you. We have plenty of time, so questions from audience? Right here.
One great talk, by the way. That was fantastic. I was gonna say, I noticed just based on your background, like with Nasser and Navav and stuff, like, is there a connection to certain medical procedures where this is like really interesting kind of to apply, basically?
So with Sasan, who's sitting here as well in the second row, last year we presented ISMAR a TBCG article on physical modeling synthesis for medical specifically, and how we can use that for different tissues. So it might be especially interesting, for example, if you're working with a lot of visually indistinguishable tissue. Like, for example, in the brain, you might not know when you're just, if you're a neurosurgeon, right, you might not know if what you have in front of you is a benign or is a good or a bad tumor, and so, or where the nerves might exactly be lying. So in this situation, it would be really helpful that when you interact with these visually not so distinguishable, but physically very different things that might need different treatment in the surgical field, that you have these realistic sonic interactions that help you in addition.
Very cool. Thank you.
Any other questions?
Have you tried the material mismatch conditions? Like, it's not generic sound, but it's soft materials that play metal sound, and how that can potentially trick the person of the material perception.
Can you repeat that? I think
playing different material sound can, is there any plan to do it?
Wood and I play the sound of glass.
For instance, yes.
Okay, so that's a very good question, because if we use, and that's also one of the reasons why actually having these generic sounds nowadays is not just not so nice for maybe the interaction, but it could also be misleading of what the actual material is that we would be facing. Because if, for example, that generic sound that someone has chosen in the default settings of the sample scenes of whatever package we're using is coincidentally higher in pitch, for example, and thus resembles glass better than it would a plastic, we might just be tricked into thinking that things are different than they actually are. So we didn't specifically look at it in our evaluation, but I think it's definitely a known effect that can be achieved if the sound tricks you. And there's also papers on that, actually, that are cited in our paper. Yeah.
Yeah, we can have one more question over there.
Hi, I'm curious, how do you acquire the material properties?
Okay, so for this, we were just using, because we knew what kind of material classes would be in our model, so we were just like looking up these values, and you can find them from, for example, biomechanical research that has tested like all of these materials, and we used averages of these. But of course, every single product or every single material might have a slightly nuanced, right? Not every wood is wood. So there's also some difference there, but for now we had just looked up. But there's also a way of estimating, I think, these based on some visual properties and so on. So there's also work done in estimating material properties, for example, for more realistic real-time interactions, I think.
For estimating, do you mean like visually or like?
Yeah. for
Okay.
example, or and
Right.
also from sound.
And you only have and you only include 3 properties for now?
Yeah.
Okay. All right. Thank you.
All right, let's thank the presenter.
I'll get started. So my name's Akshay Perchuri, and this is the Ego Trigger paper that I'll be presenting about, basically using this audio-driven image capture approach to try and enable applications like human memory enhancement. And this work was done in collaboration with Google, and I have many wonderful co-authors that I'll also talk about a bit at the end. And so the premise of this paper is smart glasses are going to have sensors and some kind of artificial intelligence that basically helps the people wearing them perceive the world as they do, or better, ideally, right? It amplifies their perception in some way. And ideally, you can just put this kind of like lightweight form factor glasses on, and while you're riding a bike or something, or in many sort of everyday scenarios where you might normally wear glasses or not, but it's lightweight enough to sort of take everywhere with you all day. And one of the hypotheses for this work is that people will actually wear these glasses all day, and they'll do a variety of things while wearing those glasses, and they can ask their assistants in some way, like in this example, Gemini, whether or not they did something. For example, did they take their medication in the morning, and would be able to sort of remind them that they did, for example, or tell them that they didn't. And so that brings about a very key requirement here, which is these glasses need to last all day, and that's very difficult to do given they have fairly constrained hardware in the first place due to size and various other limitations like thermal constraints. And we can't just wait for the hardware to get smaller, better, more power efficient, et cetera, because it usually takes a long time. So we also have to sense smarter in some way, using what we have, come up with better algorithms for sensing the world around us. And the interesting thing is humans are pretty good about sensing the world around them. And when we interact with different objects, or if you were to hear someone open that door, for example, you can usually have some conclusion without even looking at the door that someone came into the room, for example. Or if someone sat down beside you without even looking at them, you can probably tell that someone sat down beside you. And we tend to remember those interactions. So there's some cognitive science literature that kind of supports that these hand-object interactions and the noises associated with them are partly what we remember, which the paper talks about this in a bit more detail. And there's tons of these examples, right? Like, different things you can do in a kitchen, for example, like scrubbing a dish, or opening a drawer, or closing a case, or different kinds of things like that. And there's sort of large-scale data sets that capture these sort of audio-visual correspondences in some way. And the question ends up being, can we build a system that does smarter sensing to reduce the energy consumption of smart glasses, while enabling this sort of like long-term passive human memory enhancement experience that you were aiming for? And generally speaking, for most of these smart glasses systems, the microphone is less expensive in terms of energy consumption than a camera, for example. So even the sort of best low-power cameras you can think of generally take a bit more energy consumption than the lower-power microphones. And there are these large-scale data sets, like I said, of these sort of action audio correspondences that you can leverage to train models that kind of detect what's happening just based on an audio signal. And it was great to see YAMNet used in an earlier paper today, but generally speaking, there's these foundation sort of audio models that are super simple. YAMNet, I think, is like 12 years old at this point. And they're pretty usable for this sort of transfer learning task that would enable this sort of audio-driven image capture model. And there's also more complicated models that we didn't use in this paper, we talked about briefly in the paper, that you could also use to have potentially better semantic granularity. And even those smaller, sort of more aged models like YAMNet, they're really capable in terms of distinguishing sound, and they're very meaningful as a proxy for on-device capabilities for these sort of constrained smart glasses devices. And to kind of motivate the work, we also have various ways to evaluate human memory enhancement, right? So we have these data sets that basically will ask this question based on some imagery that's been seen. In what location in the house did I see the car? Or what location did I see the car inside the house? And or where did I leave my medication, for example? And it could remind you of that information. And so the answer to that original question is yes, we can build this kind of system. Ego Trigger aims for this. So fundamentally speaking, it is triggering based on some audio classification to subsequently capture images for some period of time, and then automatically turn off the image capture if it no longer senses any salient audio signals. And the sort of takeaway is you could capture fewer frames while still having good performance on this human memory enhancement task, which makes a big difference for energy consumption, which we'll talk about. The model itself is super simple. There's way more details in the paper, but for the sake of this, it is this pre-trained YAMNet model. You fine-tune this classification ahead. You add some extra layers, and you basically have this model that produces these probabilities that you then can design a system around and decide whether or not to gate camera capture in some way. And then generally speaking, this is a very number-dense table, but the model itself is able to reliably predict these hand-object interactions while being reasonably robust to other environmental sounds like whistling or something else that doesn't really have to do with a near-field sort of peripersonal hand-object interaction. And qualitatively, these are just images in this case of or streams of images where the black boxes indicate an image not being captured. And with ego trigger, even though some images are not captured, the images that we care about relevant to certain questions that are in these data sets are captured, and you can still answer the question correctly. So it's triggering effectively enough to maintain performance on some data set. And then the more important thing is, you can kind of stay on this Pareto frontier, right? So you can significantly reduce the amount of frames captured while incurring a relatively low performance cost in terms of this memory enhancement scenario. This is another dense slide, but the important thing to think about here in terms of power consumption, we use this very sort of equivalent to some of the on-device hardware, but sort of Raspberry Pi based and some additional sensors that are comparable in power profile to what's actually in smart glasses in industry. We basically observed this 17% power improvement in terms of power reduction, and we also want to postulate that one of the big advantages to reducing this capture data isn't just turning the camera off or reducing the number of images captured, but it's also reducing the amount of images that get transferred over to some puck, right? So most of the devices like Meta's glasses, Google's glasses, they all have some sort of other device in the loop where you're transmitting information to that device. So if you can capture less information and also transmit less information, it makes a significant impact on the energy consumption in this case. And so one very specific thing I want to drive towards is how this work kind of plays into the future of smart glasses in particular. So for those of you who know some AR/VR history, the Sword of Damocles was one of the first prototypes, many decades ago by Ivan Sutherland. And Microsoft's HoloLens 2, for example, was another big leap where tons of people, especially academically, were using it for a variety of things to kind of prove out these various scenarios or applications for AR, for example. And then earlier this year, Google Glasses was debuted kind of at TEDx and a few other places. And there's a lot of excitement around those kinds of form factor glasses and what Meta is doing as well, and Apple potentially as well. So we've definitely come a long way from what was around in 1968, for example. And again, we're pretty good as humans about sensing the world in a very sort of efficient manner, right? So the goal here is we want smart glasses to help us do that in some way, and we want those sensors to last all day and 8 hours, 12 hours, whatever you want to define as all day. And they're ideally aligned with how we perceive the world, or they're objectively better, right? So if we don't notice something, they do notice something, for example, and it's kind of autonomous and requires very minimal sort of input from the user themselves. And I think if the glasses actually help us do that, the future's really cool. To give a very sort of more motivational high-level quote, Fred Brooks in 1994 talked a lot about this notion of intelligence amplification versus what we normally think of artificial intelligence today. And I very much resonate with this in the sense that I think the best tools that people will readily use in the future largely will be these sort of scenarios where you have a mind and a machine kind of in synthesis, doing something, navigating tasks throughout the day, for example. And personally, I agree with Fred that that's more fruitful than literal AI replacing a bunch of functionality that people have every day. And then kind of tying this to healthcare a little bit, which part of this paper was tied to this all-day sensing scenario to help people who have cognitive issues with memory, who might need memory enhancement, is healthcare is a really interesting field. There's tons of super cool works, like even the previous talk that you guys saw, where healthcare could be applicable. And Eric Topol, for example, is a famous physician who talks about this a bit in terms of medical history. And there's certain visions, for example, one that's at UNC Chapel Hill, which various folks, including Henry Fuchs, are involved in at UNC Chapel Hill, involves this scenario where you can have this consultation and therapy and various steps in terms of an AR/AI assistant being useful for your rehabilitation process. And then ego trigger kind of plays into this overall in the sense that it could last all day for various sensing capabilities, detect those scenarios where someone is interacting with a door, for example, or taking steps in their house, for example, or doing various things like that. And ultimately the goal there being you can get these glasses to last all day and do more interesting things, even though the hardware isn't quite there yet today. And yeah, that's the talk. Thank you for coming or listening, and then feel free to email me at that email address if you have questions or are generally interested in this direction, and then that QR code should take you to a project website that has a paper and then GitHub code and a bunch of other stuff.
Thank you. All right. We can have 4 minutes for Q&A, so if there's any questions, okay.
Hi, Ife Chang, Carnegie Mellon University. So I'm wondering to what extent your current approach aligns with how people perceive and, I guess, build memory for their day.
Yeah.
And to what, can you comment a bit on how we can get closer to that perception as well?
Yeah, there's two parts to this answer I'm going to give. So one I'll say is, in terms of the evaluation that's in the paper itself, it's very focused on like the system, right? And kind of proving out it works for some scenario where hand-object interactions are the main focus. But like I think you're kind of alluding to, like, if you turned your head and remembered, or you wanted to remember someone's face you saw, for example, right? This system would totally fail at that. There's no audio event that triggers that, for example. But one of the things we're trying to think about is, if we had these large-scale studies, for example, where like you take 3 hours of recordings with some smart glasses, and we have like 10 people annotate like what would they want to remember from that scenario, right? And then kind of aligning that with questions you can ask a model and see like which types of approaches work. So in terms of answering the second part I was going to say, to answer your question, I think it's going to be a mix of models, right? So like ego trigger is more useful in this like peripersonal, like things related to what you are doing in a certain space and with respect to a certain space, versus another model that might have, work better with like, different resolution images or different kinds of image-based gating, saliency-based methods or something else. It might do a better job with those scenarios where it's like, can I remember this slide that I saw, for example? People do different things where they try and discard frames in some like smart way. So that's, I think the future, it'll be kind of a mixture of different models that are trying to approximate what humans do in terms of perception, right? But then also beat it in terms of reliability.
Thank you.
All right. Any questions? We do have plenty of time. All right.
I think you already have answered for the previous question, but how do you compare your approach with other like IMU sensor-based triggering, for instance, or potentially mixing that with your approach?
Yeah, so in the paper, at least, we do compare to some like AIMU baseline, but for the context of the papers, again, centered around like hand-object interactions. So we're just assuming you just have smart glasses. So there are certain like head poses you can do where like, food logging is one of them, right? You can kind of, to some degree, classify if someone's eating just based on an IMU in the glasses even, for example, under your head pose. Generally speaking, I think ego trigger is a bit more broad, at least when you're talking about only the IMU in the glasses and not like in a watch or anything else. So that's one part of it. The other part of it is, I think, to answer the part of the question you mentioned about integrating IMU information into this model as well, that we left for sort of future work, just because the data sets we were using had very noisy IMU, and in terms of collecting new data sets with this, paired audio, video, and IMU, it would have been a bit more time consuming and out of the scope of the, this particular paper. But I agree that's like, makes total sense as like a next step.
Right. One more question over there.
Talk. I have this question. If there's like similar hand-object interactions, how does your system kind of filter out? Like, for instance, if I put something in a drawer, I could put multiple things in that drawer. How does it understand the difference between what I'm trying to look for?
Yeah, so in terms of in terms of ambiguity or semantic ambiguity, in terms of like what the sounds are, I think our system, especially this earlier table I talked about, which there's way more information in the paper, but like in terms of like the false positive rate and like how we think about, we ideally don't care if we trigger accidentally and just capture extra information, right? So in the case you mentioned, as long as that drawer sound is detected, the model turns on, and like Gemini, for example, receives a buffer of images where then it can, use its significantly better reasoning capabilities in order to distinguish, which objects were put in or what order and things of that sort.
Okay, I see. So it's kind of connected to a more thinking
Yeah,
model.
the ideal is like, so again, this is like a very Google internship motivated work.
Yeah.
So the ideal thing is there is like have this model on glasses, it's passing information to a puck, and then it goes on to more powerful models.
I see. Understand.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank the presenter again. And
Hi everyone, my name is Mauricio Flores Vargas, and I'll be presenting our paper in first-person vocal realization in XR and its influence on perceived presence and audiovisual quality, which was produced with Dr. Enda Bates and Rachel McDonald in Trinity College. So auditory feedback is an essential component in how we decode the environments and the objects within it. And the way we perceive and interact with the world is strongly shaped by auditory information. In extended reality, sound has shown to elicit physical and physiological responses, and psychological responses, like lowering heart rate and respiration, inducing relaxation, and enhancing immersion, presence, and plausibility of the virtual environment. While prior research has investigated different factors about sound perception, spatialization, and oralization in immersive virtual environments, most studies have done it when the auditory feedback is generated by an external source within the environment. So that means that the user perceives these sounds in a third-person perspective, acting only as the listeners and not as the effectors of the sounds. In contrast, research in self-produced sounds, or those perceived in first person, remain very limited, particularly when considering the user's own voice as a way of interacting, and acoustic exploration. And while there are some studies that have studied the effect of real-time vocal realization in audio-only and VR contexts, they always focus in vocal production and adaptation, and they only measure parameters like vocal comfort, fundamental frequency, sound pressure level, and spectral moments. So the aim of our study was to explore how quality of acoustic and visual rendering influences user perception in immersive virtual environments, specifically virtual reality and mixed reality. So we focus in three aspects. First, it was the perceived quality of each of the sensory modalities, the integration between audio and visual feedback, and as well as a sense of presence as a measure of cognitive engagement. And most importantly, we did it using first-person vocal interaction as a way for users to explore the acoustic properties of the virtual space. To do so, we use a set of 5 measures. Was audio naturalness and audio reverberance to measure the perceived quality and spatial impression of the sound. Visual resolution to assess the perceived quality of and the sharpness of the rendered visuals. Audio-visual integration to examine how well the two modalities work together as coherent feedback. And for presence, we use the iGroup presence questionnaire, which includes subscales of spatial presence, realism, and involvement. All of these items were rated in a 7-point Likert scale, from -3 to 3, to ensure consistency in the audio, the visual, and the presence measures. So this is a bit of the pipeline that we use for this sound realization. Unity rendered the visuals, and it also tracked the head's position and rotation of the user, which was then transferred to Reaper using OSC protocol. And then in Reaper, the live input of the microphone was convolved using special input responses to create the auralized sound, which then was fed back to the user via headphones. So to explore the acoustic properties of the environment, participants conducted a series of vocal tasks while they were immersed in the space. These tasks served 2 purposes. They allowed participants to hear their own voice auralized in real time, and it also provided a consistent and structured activity for them to do in every single condition. So here are some of the tasks: counting 1 to 10, sustaining a vowel A, reciting some standard phrases, and singing happy birthday as well. The purpose was to have a variety of vocal sounds that allow participants to perceive the acoustic room response as well as the auralization quality. So we conducted 2 studies. In the first one, the audio was, well, both of the factors have 3 levels of rendering. For the audio, we used measured auralization, which was input responses created from acoustic measurements. We have synthesized auralization, which we created using a virtual room encoder and FDN reverberation to create like the acoustic response of the space, and no auralization. And for the visual factor, we had full resolution, that it was the full resolution of the Quest 3, that is around 4.6 megapixels, and low resolution, in which we dropped the visual resolution to 1 megapixel, that is around 22% of the full resolution of the headset. And then we had a no visual condition as well. So here's a snippet.
The blue spot is on the key again. The blue spot is on the key again. When the sunlight strikes raindrops in the air, they act as a prism and form a rainbow. Happy birthday to you. Happy birthday to you. Happy birthday, dear someone. Happy birthday to you.
So the way
blue spot
Jay cannot,
is on the key again.
the way that Jay cannot hear Billie Jean anymore, I cannot hear Happy Birthday anymore after 64 participants. And then it was 9 blocks of a lot of it. So key findings was that audio feedback, when there was audio reverberation, there was higher scores in presence and audiovisual integration, which suggests that real-time vocal auralization paired with coherent visuals positively influences the experience. Interesting enough, when it was the questions of audio-related questions, participants could discriminate between the 3 conditions of audio, ranking measured audio higher and no audio lower. But for all the other measures that were not audio-related, there was no significant differences between measured and synthesized audio, but there was difference with no auralization. You also find that full resolution consistently outperformed all of the other visual conditions, meaning that was showing the relevance of visual fidelity as a dominant perceptual cue in multisensory experiences. Now, to further examine then sound auralization, how sound auralization influenced the sense of presence and perceived audiovisual quality, we conducted a second experiment, but this time it was comparing virtual reality with mixed reality. So for the visual condition, we created a high fidelity reconstruction of the physical space that accurately matched the dimensions, layouts, and objects. And we added as well extra posters in the space, in the virtual and the real world, to allow for more quality comparisons. So you can see on the top of the image, that's a virtual reality room, and in the bottom, that's the physical room. So close enough. And the mixed reality condition was just the pass-through feature of the Quest 3 to provide a real-time video representation of the space. For the audio conditions, since special measured and synthesized auralization didn't show significant differences, we decided just to use measured auralization against no auralization. And yes, so what we found, it was like in experiment 1, presence increased when vocal auralization was included. However, we didn't find any differences between virtual reality and mixed reality. Interesting enough, contrary to what we expected, results revealed significantly lower scores for mixed reality in both audiovisual integration and visual resolution. We thought that mixed reality would be higher, but this might be answered, the reason could be because of the pass-through quality is still very, very low, and the amount of visual artifact that it produces. or as well because you use a IPQ questionnaire that is not really used for virtual reality. Sorry, for mixed reality. It's done for virtual reality, not for mixed reality, sorry. Similarly, the results show that VR scored higher than mixed reality in the audio naturalness and audio reverberance, which was also interesting because we expected that the pass-through was going to give us a more coherent match between the oralization and the visuals. However, realism actually favors, realism actually favored mixed reality. So that means that it felt more real, but it was not perceptually better. So a bit of the summary of our findings. First, present vocal feedback played a meaningful role in shaping perception in XR. Real-time vocal oralization significantly increased presence and audiovisual integration. Perception of oralization seems to be context dependent, in which when you're thinking of audio, they kind of, participants can tell the difference, but when there's other type of measures, they don't really tell. Visual fidelity strongly shapes the multimodal perception, being like the highest factor. And mixed reality was not necessarily a better perceptual experience, although we have a bit of reservations with these results because of the limitations. But it seems that mixed reality felt more real, but it ranked lower than VR. So yeah, some of the limitations we found is that we had to show the UI in the no visual condition for participants to be able to follow the instructions, that we think it might have given them some spatial awareness instead of the black void that we expected. As well, some ambience of the sound, even though users were noise-canceling headphones, maybe they could hear a bit of the auralization of the actual space, well, of the acoustic of the space. The IPQ that we use, the questionnaire, is not really designed for mixed reality, so this could have also hindered the results. And future work, we think we could extend these studies to measure other perceptual constructs like sense of embodiment. We can explore audiovisual realization in other contexts, like creating digital twins for musical performances or education or cultural heritage preservation. That's it, sorry. And, well, investigate further with different type of rooms, different types of reverberation profiles, and also different rendering techniques like Gaussian splicing or other rendering techniques. And that's me. Thanks so much.
Okay. Any questions?
Here.
So you mentioned this briefly at the end in the limitations, but when we wear active noise cancellation headphones, we can hear our own speech pretty well.
Mm-hmm.
So, I mean, in your study, was the, I'd say, virtual room and the real room, like, geometrically very similar? I mean, you rebuilt it in the second one, but was it very similar? And how do you think it would change the perception if I'm in a very small room, but in a virtual environment? I'm in a very big room, and I can still hear the overlay of my real physical oralization and that virtual one that you're creating.
Yes, so the whole point was to use noise-canceling headphones to block the actual oralization of the space. But even if they were wearing the headphones, if they shouted, for example, they could hear a bit of the bleed of the actual room. So it was not completely anechoic when they're hearing their own voice. For example, for the no oralization, it was not completely an anechoic sound. So, well, there has to be, if you're in a small room that has stronger early reflections, there has to be an effect of somehow, you know what I mean? But we don't really know exactly what. And the problem is that we couldn't conduct this experiment in a sound-treated room because we needed a mixed reality version. So we had it to be in an actual space. And doing it in a acoustically treated room is not gonna give us any nice reverberation because it's like that. So that was a bit of a compromise in which, because of mixed reality, we needed to be in a physical room. And then, well, limitations of the headphones that as much as we try, there's always gonna be a bit of bleed.
Any questions? I have one question.
Mhm.
Where was the sound source was located?
The sound source?
Yeah.
The sound source was your own voice.
I mean, like, but still you can place in your belly or in your head, right? So if you play the sound.
Okay, I'm not sure if I understand exactly, but in here, there was no sound source.
Mm.
The sound source was your own voice.
Mm.
So you had a microphone beside your voice, and there was no external sound source. You were talking,
Mhm.
so it was exactly where your voice, where your mouth is. You know what I mean? So I'm not sure if I'm not sure if I
Oh,
understand the question.
maybe I misunderstood your presentation, but you have this condition of audio for recorded one. I mean, not mixed. Sorry, measured one, and then the other condition was what was that? The
Synthesize.
synthesized. For the synthesized one, where the sound was.
Oh, okay. When we were designing the synthesized input response,
Mm.
we matched the measurements of the room,
Mm.
and then we put the listener and the sound source to create the input response almost beside it. It was, I think, if I remember correctly, I might be wrong. It was, I think, 5 centimeters high and 2 centimeters behind.
Mm.
And then we ran a sine sweep to create the virtual input response.
All right. Okay. Any questions? All right. Then that concludes this session, and then thanks again for all.